Good night, friend. Pull up whatever you sleep with tonight. A blanket, a pillow, a warm drink, maybe just the quiet, and get comfortable, because tonight we're going somewhere most people have never really thought about. We're going to talk about the 1950s woman and her relationship with her body. Not in the abstract, not in the way a museum exhibit would frame it behind glass, but up close and personal, the way women actually lived it, the tips they passed between themselves over coffee, the magazine clippings they kept folded in kitchen drawers, the small daily rituals that kept them, as they would have said, trim. The secret diet tricks that every woman of that era seemed to know, the ones nobody really writes about as history because they seem too small, too ordinary, too domestic to matter. They mattered. They mattered enormously. Before we go any further, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into the real texture of ordinary lives in the past, please take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who want exactly this. Long, slow, thoughtful history that you can actually fall asleep to. And if you want to drop a comment telling me where in the world you are right now and what time it is, I love knowing. Someone is always watching this at 2 a.m, eating crackers and calling it research. Now. Dim the lights if they are on. Let the room go soft. And let me take you somewhere. It is 1953. It is a Tuesday morning somewhere in suburban America, and a woman is standing in front of a bathroom mirror in a slip and her stockings, tilting her head slightly to the left, studying her reflection with the particular focused expression that women of that era reserved for a very specific kind of internal accounting. She's not getting ready for anything special. She has to drive the children to school, come home, start the laundry, maybe walk to the store before 3 o'clock. But first, she is looking at herself, not with vanity, not exactly, with calculation. She turns sideways. She checks the line of her silhouette, the place where her waist meets her hip, the slight curve or non-curve of her stomach under the slip. She's running a quiet mental audit that she performs every single morning as automatically as brushing her teeth. And in a moment she will go downstairs and make decisions about breakfast based on the results of that audit. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the way you make dozens of small calibrations every day without really noticing you are making them. This is where our story lives tonight. Not in the dramatic, not in the extreme, but in the small and the ordinary and the quietly relentless. The day-to-day strategies that women in mid-century America used to manage their weight in a world that watched them constantly and had very specific, very rigid ideas about what a respectable woman's body was supposed to look like. Some of what they did was genuinely clever. Some of it was bizarre. Some of it was dangerous in ways they were never told. Some of it has been quietly recycled by modern wellness culture and sold back to us under new names at a significant markup. And some of it was simply the product of living in a time when the relationship between women, their bodies, and the food on their tables was governed by a set of rules so deeply embedded that most women who followed them never thought to question whether they were rules at all. They seemed like common sense. They seemed like just how it was. Let me start at the beginning, not with the diets themselves, but with the world that made them feel necessary. The 1950s in America were a very particular kind of world, and you already have a sense of this from the other things we've talked about in this channel. The white gloves, the calling cards, the thank you notes mailed within 48 hours, the way a woman's entire worth could be assessed in a single glance at her hat and handbag and posture, and whether her stockings had a run in them. Appearance was not a side concern in that world. It was a central concern. It was in many ways the concern, the visible surface of a life that was being judged by the neighbourhood and the church and the other women at the grocery store, and most importantly by the husband. Weight was part of that appearance in a way that had a specific texture in the 1950s, different from the dieting culture of the decades before and the decades after. It was not the emaciated thinness of the 1920s flapper or the skeletal ambition of later decades. The 1950s ideal was a specific kind of slim, curved but controlled, soft but disciplined, feminine but definitely not fat. Marilyn Monroe gets cited constantly in discussions about 1950s body ideals, usually as evidence that curves were acceptable, even celebrated in that era. And there is something to that. But Marilyn Monroe was also, by most historical accounts, a woman who dieted carefully, who managed her weight strategically, who was herself subject to the scrutiny of a studio system that had very specific requirements for how her body was supposed to look on a given day. The curves were acceptable, yes. The curves were also something you were expected to maintain through effort and discipline, not something you were simply allowed to have however they came. The fashion of the era made this extremely tangible. Christian Dior's new look, which dominated women's fashion through most of the late 1940s and into the 1950s, was built around a silhouette that required a specific body underneath it. The nipped waist, the full skirt, the structured bodice, all of it assumed a certain relationship between the wearer's actual body and the ideal the clothing was trying to project. Women wore girdles, as we've talked about before, but the girdle was not a substitute for the underlying body. It was an assistant to it. A woman who was significantly overweight by the era's standards could not simply be girded into the new look. The underlying architecture had to be roughly right. The girdle smoothed and controlled, but it could not fundamentally restructure. This meant that what happened at the kitchen table, what went into a woman's body over months and years, had direct and daily visual consequences in a way that felt inescapably connected to her worth as a person, her success as a wife, her standing in the community. And so women managed it. They managed it the way they managed everything, quietly, privately, with a kind of pragmatic resourcefulness that never advertised itself as anything remarkable, because it was not supposed to be remarkable. It was just what you did. The first thing to understand about the 1950s, woman's relationship with food, is that she was not operating in a vacuum. She was operating in a culture that was actively, aggressively, relentlessly telling her things about food through every available channel. Television was new and was being used by advertising companies with extraordinary sophistication to shape what women believed about what they should be eating, what they should be buying, what a well-managed kitchen and a well-managed body looked like. Women's magazines, Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, McCall's Woman's Day, were thick with advertisements for food products, and also, in the same issues, thick with diet advice. The same page might tell you to make a beautiful lemon cream pie for your husband's dinner party, and inform you in the adjacent column that the modern woman maintains her figure through careful portion control and the wisdom to resist rich desserts. The contradiction was not considered a contradiction. It was considered the natural situation of a woman's life. You cooked everything. You served everything. You were responsible for feeding everyone in your household beautifully and generously, and you yourself ate less. That was the basic arithmetic, and it was so thoroughly normalized that most women never paused to notice how strange it was. You cooked the pie. You served the pie. You watched other people eat the pie and you ate a very small piece of pie, or possibly no pie, and you were content with this arrangement, or at least you performed contentment. The strategies they used to navigate this world were varied and often surprisingly sophisticated. Let me take you through them the way a woman of that era might have taken you through them, not as a formal list, but the way a friend tells you things over coffee, circling back, adding details, sometimes pausing to note that something is strange or worth thinking about. The first and most fundamental strategy was what we might today call calorie awareness, though that term was not yet in common use in its modern sense. The science of calories, the idea that food energy could be quantified and tracked, and that weight management was essentially a matter of keeping the numbers aligned, was not new in the 1950s. The calorie as a unit had been established in the 19th century, and by the early 20th century, physicians and researchers like Lulu Hunt Peters, whose 1918 book Diet and Health was a sensation and remained influential for decades, had popularized the idea of counting calories as the basis of weight control. Peters was remarkable, actually. Her book, subtitled With Key to the Calories, was the first major best-selling diet book in American history, and it sold over 2 million copies. She wrote conversationally, humorously, directly to her female readers, and her basic message was straightforward. Weight is determined by how much you eat relative to how much you move, and if you want to weigh less, you need to eat fewer calories. She was right, in the mechanical sense. And her book shaped how women thought about food for decades afterward, including into the 1950s, when the calorie had become a standard unit of domestic calculation. Women of the 1950s often knew roughly how many calories were in the foods they ate regularly, not because they sat down and added them up with a pencil, necessarily, though some absolutely did, but because this kind of knowledge had been absorbed from magazines, from doctors' pamphlets, from the informal transfer of information between women that happened at every gathering. A woman at a church coffee hour in 1954 knew, in a general way, that a slice of bread was one thing and a celery stalk was quite another. She knew that butter was the dangerous part of butter and bread. She knew that cottage cheese was safe and that cream cheese was not safe in the same way. This knowledge shaped what she ate without her necessarily thinking of it as a diet. It was just how she ate. It was background knowledge that operated continuously in low gear, informing every small decision throughout the day. Peters was remarkable, actually. Her book, subtitled With Key to the Calories, was the first major best-selling diet book in American history, and it sold over 2 million copies. She wrote conversationally, humorously, directly to her female readers, and her basic message was straightforward. Weight is determined by how much you eat relative to how much you move, and if you want to weigh less, you need to eat fewer calories. She was right, in the mechanical sense. And her book shaped how women thought about food for decades afterward, including into the 1950s, when the calorie had become a standard unit of domestic calculation. Women of the 1950s often knew roughly how many calories were in the foods they ate regularly, not because they sat down and added them up with a pencil, necessarily, though some absolutely did, but because this kind of knowledge had been absorbed from magazines, from doctors' pamphlets, from the informal transfer of information between women that happened at every gathering. A woman at a church coffee hour in 1954 knew, in a general way, that a slice of bread was one thing and a celery stalk was quite another. She knew that butter was the dangerous part of butter and bread. She knew that cottage cheese was safe and that cream cheese was not safe in the same way. This knowledge shaped what she ate without her necessarily thinking of it as a diet. It was just how she ate. It was background knowledge that operated continuously in low gear, informing every small decision throughout the day. The second strategy, and this one is fascinating for how thoroughly it has been adopted and readopted by every subsequent generation of diet culture, was the manipulation of food volume. The idea that you could eat a satisfying amount of food in physical terms while consuming fewer calories by choosing foods that were low in caloric density but high in bulk. Raw vegetables were the classic example. Celery became almost a mythological food in 1950s diet culture, not because anyone particularly loved celery, but because it was believed, not entirely without basis, that it took more energy to digest celery than celery actually contained. This idea that certain foods had negative caloric value because they required work to process was not entirely accurate science, but it was not entirely without foundation either, and it persisted across decades because it served a useful psychological function. It gave women permission to eat something without guilt. Cucumbers, radishes, raw carrots, lettuce, green pepper strips, these formed a kind of vocabulary of safe eating that women of the era understood intuitively. Before a meal, before a party, when hunger arrived at an inconvenient hour, the answer was often raw vegetables, not because they were particularly pleasurable, but because they occupied the space of eating without the consequence of eating. Women kept vegetable trays in their refrigerators at a time when this required some effort, because refrigerator technology in the early 1950s was not yet the effortless preservation machine it would become. Having a ready supply of washed, cut vegetables for snacking was a deliberate choice, a strategy, even if the woman making it would never have called it that. She would have called it keeping something sensible to nibble on. The third strategy is one that sounds almost comically simple, and yet was taken extremely seriously in mid-century diet advice, both from physicians and from the popular press. Chewing slowly. This sounds like the most trivial possible piece of advice, but it was repeated with enough frequency and enough conviction in the diet literature of the era that it clearly carried real cultural weight. The theory behind it was that eating slowly gave the body time to register fullness before more food had been consumed than was necessary. Eating quickly, by contrast, meant eating past the point of satiety without knowing it. There was a physician named Horace Fletcher who had popularized this idea in the early 20th century, advocating for extreme thorough chewing of every bite, sometimes 30 or 40 chews per mouthful, before swallowing. Fletcher had somewhat extreme ideas and was not without his critics, but the basic principle, that pace of eating influenced how much one ate, circulated widely in women's health advice and lingered through the mid-century period. Women were told, in magazine columns and doctors' offices, and the informal transmission of advice between friends, that one of the simplest and most effective things they could do to manage their weight was to put down their fork between bites and take their time. There is research now that supports the general direction of this advice, even if the specifics were sometimes elaborated beyond what the evidence justified. Eating more slowly does appear to be associated with consuming less food overall, because the hunger signals that regulate appetite operate on a delay that fast eating can outpace. The women of the 1950s were working with a piece of practical wisdom that turned out to be at least partially correct, even if they arrived at it through intuition and cultural transmission rather than clinical trial. Now let me take you into the kitchen, because the strategies that operated at the preparation stage, before food ever reached the table, were in some ways the most interesting and the most characteristic of the era. The 1950s was a period of extraordinary transformation in American food culture. It was the era of convenience foods, canned soups, frozen dinners, packaged mixes, processed cheese, instant coffee, and dozens of other products that were being marketed to American housewives with the promise that modern food technology had made cooking simultaneously easier, better, and more refined. The television commercial worked its way into kitchens across the country, with images of gleaming white appliances and mothers who produced perfect meals apparently without effort, surrounded by products that had done the hard work for them. This transformation had complex implications for women who were simultaneously managing a household's nutrition and managing their own weight. On one hand, many of the new convenience foods were calorie-dense in ways that older, more labor-intensive cooking had not been. Processed foods often contained more sugar, more fat, and more sodium than their homemade equivalents, partly because these ingredients improved shelf life and palatability, and partly because, as it turned out, they also made foods more addictive. On the other hand, the same food industry that was selling convenience was also, almost immediately, selling the solution to the problem it had created. Diet products began appearing in the marketplace during this period, with increasing frequency: low-calorie salad dressings, artificially sweetened beverages, crackers made with fewer calories than their traditional equivalents, products that promised the pleasure of eating with less of the consequence, and that were marketed almost exclusively to women. The woman in the kitchen navigated between these two worlds with the particular kind of pragmatic intelligence that domestic life in that era required. She made full-fat roasts and rich casseroles for her husband and children. She was judged by the quality and generosity of what she put on the table, and she ate differently from the rest of the family, often invisibly so, often without comment, sometimes without anyone at the table even noticing. One of the techniques women used was what might be called strategic substitution, replacing higher-calorie ingredients with lower-calorie alternatives in dishes that were being prepared for family meals that she herself would eat smaller amounts of. Cottage cheese appeared with remarkable frequency in 1950s diet advice because it was high in protein, relatively filling, and much lower in calories than the cream cheese or sour cream it might otherwise replace. You see it used as a filling for baked potatoes, as a base for dips, mixed into various casseroles to add creaminess without the full caloric weight of cream. Recipes in diet columns of women's magazines during this period show a kind of creative ingenuity that is actually somewhat impressive. Women were being asked to make food that was satisfying enough to serve to a family, appealing enough to present to guests, and manageable enough in caloric terms to fit their own needs. The solutions they developed often involved finding ways to add volume and richness of texture through lower-calorie means, using chicken broth where butter might have been used, adding bulk through vegetables that absorbed the flavors of a dish without adding its own caloric weight, using techniques like broiling instead of frying to achieve the right surface without added fat. This was not casual. It required real knowledge of ingredients and cooking technique. It required attention and care, and it was performed quietly, as a matter of course, without the kind of overt acknowledgement that would have made the management of appetite into an unseemly topic of conversation. There was a particular relationship with protein in the dietary thinking of the 1950s that predates what we now call high-protein diets by decades. The basic principle that protein is more satiating per calorie than carbohydrate or fat, and that a diet built around protein sources keeps hunger at bay more effectively than one built around starches, circulated in the popular health press of the period, though the biochemical understanding behind it was still developing. Eggs were central to this. Eggs were cheap, available, versatile, and understood to be filling in a way that a piece of toast was not. The advice to eat eggs for breakfast rather than cereal or toast appeared frequently in women's diet advice columns. A hard-boiled egg kept in the refrigerator was a standard emergency measure for the moment when hunger struck between meals and something needed to be eaten. An egg eaten before a larger meal was believed to blunt appetite for what followed. There is science now that aligns reasonably well with this intuition. Protein does increase satiety signals more effectively than equivalent calories from carbohydrates, and eggs are among the most nutrient-dense and satiating proteins available. The women who kept a bowl of hard-boiled eggs in their refrigerators in 1952 were operating on folk wisdom that turned out to have a legitimate biochemical basis. But there were also protein strategies that were less scientifically sound, some that have since been studied and found wanting, and others that were actively harmful. The high-protein crash diets that circulated during this period, promising rapid weight loss through eating almost nothing but protein, were genuinely dangerous in ways that the women following them were not told. Ketosis, the metabolic state produced by drastically reducing carbohydrates, was not understood the way it is now, and the side effects, which include fatigue, headache, bad breath, and in extreme cases cardiac stress, were often attributed to other causes or simply endured as the price of slimness. One of the most interesting corners of 1950s diet culture was the relationship with sugar and what might replace it. The desire for sweetness is ancient and powerful, and women who were managing their caloric intake with care were acutely aware that sugar was one of the easiest places for calories to accumulate invisibly and multiply without much pleasure. A spoonful of sugar in coffee, done several times a day, added up. Sweetened beverages were particularly singled out in diet advice as a category of calories that were easy to eliminate without significant sacrifice. Saccharin had existed since the late 1800s, a synthetic sweetener discovered accidentally in a chemistry laboratory and eventually finding its way into the food supply. During World War II, it had come into broader use because sugar was rationed, and the habit of using artificial sweeteners to replace sugar in coffee and tea had become normalized for many women during those years. In the post-war period, saccharin remained in use among women who were watching their weight, partly out of established habit and partly because the post-war diet advice columns continued to recommend it. The saccharin tablet was a small, slightly bitter thing that you dropped into hot liquid and stirred, and it sweetened reasonably well, if not identically to sugar. Women of the era often carried saccharin tablets in their purses in small silver dispensers that were sold specifically for this purpose. The diet soda industry, which would eventually become a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, was in its earliest infancy during this period, but the cultural groundwork for it, the idea that you could have the experience of sweetness without the calories that normally came with it, was firmly established in the way women thought about managing their intake. There is something poignant about this, actually. The saccharin tablet in the purse, the moment at a luncheon when a woman quietly drops one into a coffee while the others are taking sugar. It is such a small thing, such a private thing, but it is also the visible tip of a very large invisible iceberg of calculation and restraint and daily management that ran underneath the surface of a respectable woman's life in that era. Let me talk about the water strategies, because these too were a significant part of the 1950s approach to weight management and have been so thoroughly adopted by subsequent diet culture that they now feel timeless. Drinking a glass of water before meals to reduce appetite was a piece of advice that appeared constantly in women's diet columns and in doctors' recommendations during this period. The mechanism was understood in general terms, if not in specific biochemical detail. Water takes up physical space in the stomach, which triggers satiety signals, and because water has no calories, the effect is pure appetite suppression. A woman who drank a full glass of cold water 5 or 10 minutes before sitting down to eat would eat less without feeling significantly more deprived. Hot water and lemon was another piece of advice that circulated widely and that has been so thoroughly adopted by modern wellness culture that it now feels like an invention of recent years. In the 1950s, it appeared regularly in women's magazine health columns and was described in terms that emphasized both its digestive benefits and its ability to help with weight management. Hot water was believed to aid digestion in general, and the lemon, which was astringent and slightly stimulating to the palate, was thought to prepare the digestive system for the work ahead and also, in the folk understanding of the time, to have some mild metabolic effect. Whether any of this was precisely accurate from a biochemical standpoint is a separate question from whether it worked as a daily practice, and the two are not identical. A woman who started her morning with hot water and lemon was doing something that had real effects, hydrating after a night of sleep, starting the day with a ritual that was associated with health and discipline, and consuming something with no calories that nevertheless occupied some of the psychological space of the morning beverage. The practice also tended to delay the moment of actual caloric intake, which had its own effect on how the rest of the morning's eating went. The role of soup deserves its own discussion because it was remarkably central to 1950s diet thinking, and for reasons that hold up reasonably well to scrutiny. The theory was this: soup, consumed before a meal, reduces the total amount of food eaten during that meal, not because it is particularly filling in a caloric sense. Most clear or broth-based soups are quite low in calories, but because the act of eating soup occupies both physical stomach space and psychological eating space in a way that a glass of water alone does not. You are eating in the sociologically recognized sense, which involves lifting a utensil and bringing food to your mouth in a social context, but you are eating something that has relatively little caloric consequence. Studies done decades later on this precise question, whether consuming soup before a meal reduces total calories eaten during that meal, consistently show that it does, and the effect is not trivial. Subjects who ate a bowl of low-calorie soup before a meal consumed meaningfully fewer calories during the meal than those who did not. The women of the 1950s who started their lunches with a cup of broth-based soup were using a strategy that actually worked the way they believed it worked, which is more than can be said for some of the other things they were doing. Canned consommé was a standard refrigerator staple in diet-conscious households of the era. A can of consommé, chilled until it formed a soft jelly, was actually considered a somewhat refined dish. the kind of thing you could serve at a ladies' luncheon that signaled both sophistication and restraint. Clear soups, chicken bouillon, tomato-based broth, all of these circulated as the acceptable beginning of a diet lunch, providing the physiological benefit of pre-meal soup consumption while also being genuinely low enough in calories that they barely registered. Now I want to take you into a corner of 1950s diet culture that is somewhat darker and that requires a bit more care to discuss honestly, because not all of the strategies women used were the kind of gentle folk wisdom that happened to align with good science. Some of them were genuinely harmful, and some of them were actively promoted by the medical establishment of the time in ways that would be unthinkable today. The amphetamine diet pill is one of the most significant and troubling stories in the history of mid-century American women's health, and it is one that tends to get glossed over in romantic treatments of the era because it does not fit the image of the cheerful corseted homemaker very comfortably. Amphetamines, a class of stimulant drugs, had been developed in the 1920s and came into widespread medical use during World War II, where they were used to keep soldiers awake and alert during extended operations. After the war, they were released into the civilian medical market, and by the late 1940s and through the 1950s, they were being prescribed by physicians with extraordinary frequency as appetite suppressants and weight loss aids. The brand name Dexamyl, a combination of dextroamphetamine and amobarbital, was marketed specifically to women as a weight loss and mood elevation drug. The amphetamine suppressed appetite and boosted energy. The barbiturate was meant to smooth out the anxiety and irritability that the stimulant alone could cause. The combination was advertised in medical journals with images of contented, slim women and descriptions of the dual benefits: less hunger, better mood, improved functioning. Physicians prescribed these drugs casually. There was not, at the time, the same level of regulatory oversight of prescription drug marketing that would develop in later decades, and the medical establishment's understanding of addiction as it related to stimulants was still evolving. A woman who went to her doctor in 1954 and said she wanted to lose some weight had a reasonable chance of leaving with a prescription for what were, in effect, amphetamines. She did not necessarily know that. She knew she had been given diet pills that her doctor said were safe and effective, and she probably noticed that they worked. She did eat less, she did have more energy, she felt for a while better. The consequences, which included dependency, mood instability, insomnia, cardiovascular strain, and in some cases severe psychological effects, accumulated over time in ways that were not always connected back to the drug. Women who developed problems were sometimes told that the problems were their own: nervous disposition, fragile temperament, difficulty coping with the demands of modern life. The pills remained available for years before the scale of the problem began to generate any serious regulatory response. This is not a small footnote. It is estimated that by the mid-1950s, roughly half of all amphetamine prescriptions in the United States were going to women, the majority of them for weight loss or mood management. This was a medical culture that had decided women's bodies were appropriate testing grounds for pharmaceutical weight management, and that decision had consequences that played out across individual lives in ways that were rarely acknowledged publicly. The women who took these pills were not making naive or uninformed choices. They were doing what their doctors told them to do in a medical culture that treated slimness as a health objective worth pharmacological intervention. They were also operating in a social culture that treated visible weight gain as evidence of character failure, which made the offer of pharmaceutical assistance feel not just acceptable but necessary. Not every woman who tried diet pills in the 1950s developed a dependency. Not every prescription led to harm, but the widespread availability and casual use of amphetamine-based diet medications is part of the full picture of how women managed their weight in that era, and leaving it out would be dishonest. There were also, at the other end of the spectrum from pharmaceutical intervention, a range of herbal and folk remedies that circulated in women's diet culture of the period. These were less medically legitimized, but no less present in the informal economy of knowledge that women shared with each other. Certain teas were believed to have slimming properties, diuretic herbs that reduced water retention, or stimulant herbs like guarana that were thought to boost metabolism. Seaweed preparations were sold in health food stores, which were beginning to develop as a distinct retail category during this period, with claims about their effects on the thyroid and therefore on metabolic rate. Apple cider vinegar was consumed in small quantities before meals, with beliefs about its effects on fat digestion and blood sugar that are not entirely without recent scientific interest, though the specific mechanisms claimed for it in the 1950s were not well understood. Most of these folk remedies operated primarily through placebo effect and through the discipline of following any system consistently. The act of doing a deliberate thing before meals tends to make you more conscious of what you eat at meals, regardless of whether the specific thing has a physiological effect. A woman who drinks a tablespoon of apple cider vinegar diluted in water before every meal is a woman who is paying attention to her eating in a deliberate and ritualized way, and that attention probably has some effect on how she eats, quite apart from anything the vinegar itself is doing. Let me move now to the social and behavioral strategies, because these were in some ways the most sophisticated and the most revealing of the broader culture. Managing weight in the 1950s was not only a private physiological project, it was a social performance with its own rules and conventions and peer accountability systems. The ladies' luncheon was one of the primary social arenas in which a woman's relationship with food was on display and subject to evaluation. These gatherings, at women's clubs, at church organizations, at informal home entertaining, were occasions where food was served and shared, and where what you ate, how much you ate, and how you talked about food were all social signals. The etiquette of the era around food and eating at social gatherings was complex and somewhat contradictory. A hostess was expected to offer abundant and appealing food, and her guests were expected to eat with apparent pleasure and appreciation. Refusing food entirely was considered rude, but eating too much, or eating in a way that seemed ungoverned, was also a social failing. The art was in eating in a way that was visible and appreciative but clearly controlled, taking portions, engaging with the food, praising the cooking, but not going back for seconds in a way that would be noticed, not lingering over rich dishes in a way that suggested desire that couldn't be managed. Women developed real skill at this. They became expert at taking small portions that looked socially appropriate while consuming relatively little. They became skilled at moving food around on plates in a way that gave the visual impression of engagement. They learnt to eat the visible components of a dish, the vegetables, the protein, and leave the starchier or richer elements in a way that didn't call attention to itself. The social management of eating was a practiced art. This was also the era when the compliment about weight loss became a specific and powerful social currency. If a woman was seen to have lost weight, she was complimented on it, explicitly, warmly, publicly. "You look wonderful. Have you lost weight?" It was considered one of the nicest things you could say to a woman at a social gathering, and this social reward was a powerful reinforcing mechanism for the dietary behaviors that produced it. The approval was real and immediate and personal in a way that made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. The flip side of this, which was the social consequence of visible weight gain, was largely unspoken but no less real. Nobody said directly to a woman's face, "You have put on weight." The culture was too polite for that, but there were glances, there were slight shifts in the social temperature. There was the particular quality of the compliment that conspicuously failed to mention how she looked when that compliment would usually have been offered. Women were sensitive to these signals because the social stakes of being perceived as having let themselves go were real, and they knew it. There is a particular piece of practical wisdom that circulated among diet-conscious women in the 1950s that I find both ingenious and somewhat melancholy. It was the advice to eat something before going to a party or social event where food would be served. Something small, high in protein or fat, that would blunt appetite so that the woman would not arrive at the party hungry and make food choices she would regret under the social pressure of abundance and the desire to seem like a good guest. A hard-boiled egg eaten in the car before a dinner party. A small piece of cheese consumed quietly in the kitchen before the guests arrived. These small preemptive measures were widely recommended and widely practiced, and they served their purpose reasonably well. A woman who arrived at a social event already slightly fed was a woman who could make composed, deliberate choices about what she ate, rather than being driven by hunger to eat more than she intended. This is a strategy that modern nutritional advice has validated repeatedly under names like eating before social events to avoid overeating or mindful pre-feeding before buffets. The women of the 1950s developed it not from clinical research, but from the practical need to navigate a social world in which food was constantly present, constantly offered, and constantly watched. Exercise is part of this story too, but its role in 1950s women's weight management has its own specific character. The decade was not one that celebrated athletic or active women in the way later decades would come to do. Running, lifting weights, taking fitness classes as a regular practice. None of these were culturally encouraged for respectable married women in the way they would become. A woman who was seen jogging through the neighborhood in exercise clothes would have attracted the kind of attention that was uncomfortable for the era. Physical fitness for women was, on the whole, coded as either medical necessity or the province of young unmarried women. What was universally acceptable and quietly recommended was walking. Walking was respectable, social, compatible with a full range of domestic activities, and required no equipment or special clothing. Women walked to the store, walked with the children, walked in the afternoons during the period between lunch and the arrival of the school bus. Walking was built into the rhythm of housewifely life in a way that provided a meaningful baseline of physical activity that many modern lives lack. Housework itself was understood, during this era, to be a significant source of physical activity. The labor of running a home in the early 1950s was genuinely physical in ways that are difficult to appreciate now. Laundry, even with a washing machine, involved significant manual effort in feeding, wringing, hanging, and bringing in. Sweeping, mopping, and scrubbing floors was physically demanding. Kneading bread dough, pressing clothing with a heavy iron, lifting and carrying, all of it added up to an activity level that calories in, calories out calculations of the era actually factored in when determining how many calories a housewife needed. Women were also offered a range of light exercise recommendations in the health columns of women's magazines, specific sequences of movements designed to be done in the morning before dressing or in the late afternoon before dinner that would tighten specific areas of concern without requiring athletic clothing or any kind of public performance. These tended to focus on the waist, the hips, and the thighs, the areas of greatest preoccupation, side bends, waist twists, leg raises done on a mat laid on the bedroom floor. The exercises were never called exercise in quite those terms. They were often called figure exercises or figure correction, a phrase that located the activity firmly in the domain of appearance management rather than fitness. There was a particular apparatus that appeared in women's magazines during the early and middle 1950s that I think tells you a great deal about the era's attitudes toward women's bodies and physical effort. It was the vibrating belt machine. You have probably seen images of it, a large belt attached to a motorized frame that the user could slip around their waist or thighs, which would then vibrate against the body with the theory that this mechanical agitation would break up or dissolve fatty tissue. The vibrating belt machine was installed in beauty salons and in the increasingly common reducing salon, a specialized establishment that offered a range of passive treatments designed to slim the body without requiring the client to engage in active exercise. You went to the reducing salon, you had the belt put around your waist, you stood there for 20 minutes reading a magazine while the machine vibrated, and you were told that this was doing something useful for your figure. It was not. The science behind passive mechanical stimulation as a mechanism for fat loss does not hold up, and more sophisticated versions of this claim have been studied and debunked repeatedly in the decades since. But the vibrating belt machine was enormously popular during the 1950s precisely because it promised the result without the effort, and it operated in a cultural context where women were not supposed to be seen sweating and straining and working their bodies hard. The machine offered a form of figure management that was acceptably passive and acceptably feminine. You went to the salon, you submitted to the treatment, you returned to your regular life. The promise that this was accomplishing something real was more important than the reality of whether it was. I want to spend some time with the specific diet plans and food philosophies that were formally popularized during this period, because they are interesting both as historical artifacts and as early ancestors of diet approaches that persist today in modified forms. The Rockefeller diet, sometimes called the Mayo Clinic diet in popular circulation though it had no actual connection to the Mayo Clinic, was a strict low-carbohydrate plan that circulated in the 1950s as a mimeographed sheet passed hand-to-hand between women before the age of wide publication made such informal transmission unnecessary. The original plan was austere to the point of being almost antisocial: meat, eggs, and grapefruit in variations and combinations, with very little else. The idea behind the grapefruit component was that a specific enzyme or compound in grapefruit had fat-burning properties that would accelerate the loss produced by the low-carbohydrate eating. The fat-burning enzyme theory was not accurate, but the diet worked for rapid initial weight loss for the straightforward reason that it was extremely low in calories and carbohydrates. Anyone eating eggs and grapefruit for every meal was going to lose weight quickly, though they would also be eating a diet that was monotonous to the point of psychological torment and nutritionally incomplete in ways that could cause problems over extended use. The diet was not intended for extended use. It was a short-term intervention, a way to lose a quick 10 pounds before a wedding or a class reunion, and in that narrow sense it delivered on its promise. What was interesting about the informal circulation of this plan, the fact that it passed between women as a mimeographed sheet, copied and recopied and slightly altered in each iterations, was how it functioned as a kind of women's knowledge network, operating outside the formal channels of medical and publishing authority. Women passed it to each other directly because it worked in the immediate, visible way they needed, and because the formal channels of that knowledge, the doctor's office, the official women's magazine column, were sometimes more conservative in their recommendations than women wanted. There was a whole informal circulation of diet knowledge among women in the 1950s that operated parallel to the official discourse, sharing strategies that were more extreme, more immediate, and more practically focused than what a doctor would typically prescribe. The Stillman diet, which was formally published in 1967 but whose principles were circulating in proto-form through the diet conversations of the preceding decade, was a high-protein, very low-fat and low-carbohydrate approach that its creator, Dr. Irwin Stillman, called the doctor's quick weight loss diet. Stillman's specific addition to the high-protein principle was the requirement to drink 8 or more glasses of water per day, which he believed helped flush the byproducts of protein metabolism through the kidneys and accelerated weight loss. This approach is sometimes cited as an early forerunner of the Atkins diet and the various ketogenic approaches that followed. Women who followed high-protein, low-carbohydrate approaches in the 1950s were often operating on informal knowledge that preceded the formal publication of any plan. The principle that dramatically reducing bread, potatoes, rice, and sugar while increasing protein intake produced rapid and visible weight loss had been observed and shared among women long before it appeared in any best-selling book. It was folk knowledge, accumulated through experimentation and comparison and the informal exchange of what worked. The grapefruit itself deserves a moment of discussion beyond the specific diet that featured it, because grapefruit occupied a particular place in the dietary imagination of the 1950s that went beyond any single eating plan. Grapefruit was widely understood to be a diet food, a slimming food, a food associated with the discipline and restraint of women who were taking their figures seriously. Half a grapefruit at breakfast was a statement as much as it was a meal choice. It said something about who you were and what kind of morning you were having. It was slightly austere, slightly medicinal in its sharp bitterness, and therefore appropriately serious. There is actually some recent research suggesting that compounds in grapefruit do have mild effects on insulin levels and possibly on how the liver processes certain enzymes related to fat metabolisms. The biological mechanisms are modest, and the effects are not as dramatic as the diet mythology suggested, but they are not entirely absent either. Grapefruit was not an inert placebo as part of a calorie-controlled diet. It was a reasonably satisfying, filling, low-calorie food with some minor metabolic interest that also served a powerful psychological and social signaling function. In the economy of 1950s diet culture, it was earning its place on the breakfast plate. The 1950s also saw the early development of what would eventually become the formal meal replacement industry. Products like Metrecal, one of the first commercially produced liquid diet meal replacements, introduced in 1959, represented a new approach to the problem of reducing intake without the constant vigilance and restraint that traditional dieting required. Metrecal was a nutritionally complete liquid meal in a can, low in calories, formulated to replace 1 or 2 meals per day for weight loss. It came in a small number of flavors, was not particularly delicious, and was positioned in the marketplace as a sophisticated modern solution to a problem that had previously required enormous daily willpower. The response to Metrecal was remarkable. It became one of the fastest-selling new food products in American history, doing something like $100 million in sales in its first year on the market. The appeal was visceral and immediate. Here was a product that removed the difficulty and the temptation and the daily negotiation from eating, at least for 1 or 2 meals. You drank your can at lunch. You didn't have to think about what to eat, how much to eat, whether you were eating too much. The decision had been made for you in advance, by the product itself, and all you had to do was drink it. The success of Metrecal reflected something real and somewhat uncomfortable about the experience of dieting in that era. The daily management of appetite and intake was exhausting. It required constant attention, constant resistance, constant calculation. A product that could simply remove the burden of 2 of the day's meals, that could transform eating from a complex negotiation into a single, simple, predetermined act, addressed a genuine need. The fact that the product did not taste particularly good was almost beside the point. It wasn't supposed to be enjoyable, it was supposed to be efficient. Within a few years of Metrecal's introduction, the liquid diet meal replacement market had expanded dramatically, with multiple competitors and a range of flavors, and women who used these products had incorporated them into the dietary strategies of the era as simply another tool alongside the calorie counting and the cottage cheese and the saccharin tablets. There is a particular aspect of the dietary culture of this period that I find both fascinating and somewhat heartbreaking when you sit with it long enough, and it is the relationship between women and hunger itself. Not hunger as a physical signal, but hunger as a moral category. In the dietary thinking and popular culture of the 1950s, hunger, the experience of wanting to eat, of feeling the physical pull of appetite, was treated as something that a disciplined woman managed and suppressed, not something she listened to or accommodated. Being hungry was a sign that the diet was working. The experience of wanting to eat and choosing not to eat was framed as a form of self-improvement, a demonstration of character, a proof of the kind of restraint that made a woman respectable. This framing had deep roots in a Protestant cultural tradition that associated bodily appetite with weakness and restraint with virtue, and it had been applied specifically to women's bodies and women's eating for centuries before the 1950s. But the mid-century version was particularly insistent and particularly specific. The woman who could look at a piece of cake and decline it was demonstrating something praiseworthy. The woman who ate the cake was demonstrating something else, something that had to do with weakness and indulgence and a failure of the will that was coded as feminine failing in the deepest sense. Hunger management became a separate practice from eating, and it generated its own range of strategies. Beyond the water before meals and the vegetable snacks, there were techniques aimed specifically at getting through the hungry period without eating, waiting out the hunger, distracting yourself from it, performing some activity that demanded enough attention that the appetite receded. Some of the advice was straightforward and reasonable. Brush your teeth when you want to eat between meals, because the mint of the toothpaste affects the desire to eat, and the act of brushing serves as a kind of eating period boundary marker. Drink a glass of water. Wait 10 minutes, see if the hunger passes, because sometimes what feels like hunger is actually thirst, and even when it isn't, the physical act of consuming liquid occupies some of the same psychological space. Keep your hands busy with sewing or knitting during the hours between meals when appetite tends to peak, because occupation prevents mindless eating and the activity itself occupies attention. Other advice was less benign. The suggestion that smoking was an effective appetite suppressant was present in the culture of the 1950s in a way that is difficult to overstate now. Cigarettes were advertised to women with explicit or implicit references to weight management during this period. The Lucky Strike slogan, "Reach for a lucky instead of a sweet," had been used in the late 1920s, and the association between smoking and slimness persisted through the mid-century years. Women who smoked during this period were sometimes doing so at least in part, because cigarettes reduced appetite and gave the hands and mouth something to do in the place of eating. The nicotine in cigarettes is a genuine appetite suppressant, and the act of smoking does suppress appetite in the short term. This is pharmacologically real. It is also, as we now know with certainty, that the women of the 1950s did not, producing serious long-term health consequences that dramatically outweigh the weight management benefit. But in 1954, the science on cigarettes and health was still being contested publicly, with tobacco companies actively funding research to muddy the emerging evidence of harm. A woman who smoked instead of snacking was making a choice that her culture told her was both fashionable and disciplined, and that her doctor probably did not tell her was dangerous. I want to pivot now from the specific strategies to the infrastructure around them, the industry of advice, the institutions that produced and distributed knowledge about weight management to women, and the way that industry shaped what women believed and what they did. The women's magazine was the primary vehicle for diet advice in the 1950s, and the advice it carried was not straightforwardly informational. It was embedded in a complex web of advertising relationships that shaped what could be said and how. A magazine that ran extensive advertising for Crisco, a hydrogenated vegetable shortening that was central to the kind of cooking it was also publishing recipes for, was a magazine with a complicated relationship to any advice it might offer about reducing fat intake. A magazine funded heavily by food processing companies was a magazine that might approach the question of processed food's role in weight gain with some delicacy. This does not mean the diet advice in women's magazines was entirely corrupt or cynical. Much of it reflected the genuine best understanding of nutrition available at the time, which was often reasonably aligned with good outcomes even when the biochemical reasoning behind it was imprecise. But the frame around the advice, the implicit message about who was being addressed and what their primary obligation was shaped by the commercial context in ways that reinforced particular ideas about women, bodies, and food. The diet advice column in a women's magazine in 1955 was addressed to a woman who was responsible for feeding her family generously and beautifully, while herself remaining slim and disciplined. Both halves of that project were presented as equally natural, equally required, equally reflective of her fundamental worth. The contradiction between them was not acknowledged. It was simply the condition of women's life, presented without comment as the water in which the advice swam. Physicians also played a role in women's weight management during this period that went beyond simply prescribing diet pills, though that was certainly part of it. Weight was a topic that came up routinely in medical encounters with women in ways that it did not equally with men. Physicians of the era were working from a framework that treated a woman's weight as a significant health indicator, and also, somewhat less defensibly, as an indicator of her self-discipline and compliance as a patient. A woman who had gained weight since her last visit was a patient who had not done what she was supposed to do, and this was communicated to her in ways that ranged from gentle to shaming. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company weight charts, which had been developed in the early 20th century and were regularly updated, became the standard reference for determining whether a woman was at an appropriate weight. These charts established weight ranges for height categories that were labeled desirable weight, a term that carried its own freight of meaning since it implied that weights outside this range were not merely different but actively undesirable. Women's magazines regularly published these charts, framed as health information, and women internalized the specific numbers they were told to weigh as though those numbers were objective facts of nature rather than culturally and commercially constructed benchmarks. The target weight for a 5'4" woman in the Metropolitan Life charts of the 1950s was somewhere between 115 and 145 pounds depending on frame size, categories labeled small, medium and large, which were themselves somewhat impressionistic. A woman who fell outside the top end of that range was, according to this framework, overweight. The chart did not particularly care about muscle mass or bone density or individual metabolic variation. It was a set of numbers derived from insurance actuarial data, refined with some attention to health outcomes, but also significantly shaped by the aesthetic and social assumptions of the era. Women measured themselves against those numbers. They kept them in their heads. They weighed themselves on bathroom scales that were becoming increasingly standard household items during this period, and they interpreted the number on the scale against the number in the chart and made decisions accordingly. The scale in the 1950s bathroom was a new technology of domestic surveillance, offering a precise and daily measure of the body's relationship to the prescribed standard. Some women weighed themselves every morning, some weighed themselves weekly and treated the weigh-in as a kind of reckoning. Some avoided the scale entirely because the number was something they were not ready to face. There was a particular ritual that circulated in diet advice literature that I find revealing precisely for its mixture of practicality and psychology. It was the advice to keep a small notebook in which you recorded everything you ate, as a way of making visible the patterns of consumption that might otherwise escape conscious attention. A food diary in modern terms. The 1950s version was sometimes called a diet diary or a food record, and the principle behind it was the same as its modern incarnations. The act of writing down what you eat makes you more aware of what you eat, and awareness is the precursor to change. Women who kept food diaries in this era typically did so privately, because the practice of writing down what you ate had, in the social context of the time, a slight quality of embarrassment to it. It implied that you were dieting, that your body required management, that you were not naturally slim in the way that the cultural ideal suggested a respectable woman should be. The diary was kept in a purse or a kitchen drawer, consulted privately, filled in with the small handwriting of a woman doing a calculation she would rather not need to do. There is something I find deeply human about those diaries when you encounter accounts of them. The careful, small handwriting, the record of cottage cheese at lunch and half a grapefruit at breakfast and the piece of cake at someone's birthday party, and the note beside it that says just a small piece. The whole picture they paint of a woman conducting a continuous, meticulous audit of her own body in the private margins of her daily life, not complained about, not celebrated, just done. The practice of weighing food, using a small kitchen scale to measure portions rather than eyeballing, was also beginning to develop as a dietary strategy during this period, though it was more commonly discussed in formal diet plans than in the informal practices of most women. The idea that a portion of protein at dinner should be a specific number of ounces, and that measuring was more reliable than estimating, was present in some of the more clinical diet advice literature. For most women, the practice was less precise. A general sense of the portion sizes that constituted appropriate eating, derived from exposure to diet advice rather than from actual measurement. Let me move into an area of the 1950s diet culture that is particularly interesting from a modern perspective, which is the early understanding of what we now call glycemic index and blood sugar management. These concepts were not yet developed in their current form in the 1950s. The glycemic index as a formal measure was not established until the early 1980s, but the practical observation that eating certain kinds of carbohydrates produced rapid hunger return, while others sustained satiety for longer, was present in dietary folk wisdom of the era. The advice to choose whole grain bread over white bread when possible, for example, circulated in women's health columns with reasoning that was directionally correct, even when imprecise in its mechanism. Whole grain bread was described as more sustaining than white bread, as keeping you satisfied longer, as being better for digestion and for maintaining a steady appetite, rather than the surge and crash pattern that refined carbohydrates could produce. The specific language of blood sugar and insulin response was not in use, but the practical observation was real. Similarly, the advice to eat protein and fat with carbohydrates rather than carbohydrates alone, to have butter on your bread rather than eating plain bread, to have cheese with crackers rather than crackers alone, was present in the period in ways that aligned with the modern understanding that the combination of macronutrients affects the rate of glucose absorption and therefore the speed with which hunger returns after eating. Women were being advised, in effect, to eat in ways that minimized blood sugar spikes and subsequent hunger crashes, though the terminology of that advice was entirely different. The emphasis on breakfast deserves its own discussion, because the cultural pressure around breakfast in the 1950s was simultaneously intense and specific. Breakfast was framed as essential, the meal that set the metabolic tone for the day, that provided the energy for the morning's work, that was particularly critical for children but also significant for adults. The family breakfast was part of the performance of domestic life. The husband needed a good breakfast before work, the children needed breakfast before school, and a woman who failed to provide it was failing at something fundamental. But the breakfast that was considered appropriate for a woman managing her weight was somewhat different from the hearty breakfast she might cook for the rest of the family. eggs and toast for the family, half a grapefruit and coffee for her, or perhaps one egg without the toast, or the toast without butter. The construction of a breakfast that was nutritionally sound and visually appropriate to serve, while being calorie managed enough not to threaten the figure, was a domestic calculation that many women made every morning without making a production of it. Hot cereal occupied an interesting position in the diet thinking of the era. Oatmeal was considered both nourishing and weight appropriate because it was filling relative to its caloric content. It was slow to digest and therefore sustainable, and it was associated with simplicity and discipline rather than indulgence. A bowl of oatmeal in the morning was a frugal, sensible, Protestant-inflected choice that aligned with the qualities of self-restraint the era admired. It was also, as it turns out, a reasonably evidence-based choice. The beta-glucan fiber in oats does affect satiety signals and glucose absorption in ways that support sustained morning energy and delayed hunger return. Coffee requires its own discussion because it was practically medicinal in the way it functioned for women managing their weight during this era. Coffee suppresses appetite, at least in the short term. It does this through multiple mechanisms. Caffeine affects appetite-related hormones. The hot liquid itself creates a physical sense of fullness, and the ritual of coffee provides a psychological stopping point that separates eating periods from non-eating periods. A cup of black coffee in the mid-morning, when appetite might begin to return after breakfast, served as a placeholder that occupied the eating space without filling it with calories. The transition from coffee with cream and sugar to coffee with less or no sugar was a specific dietary move that women made and that they were advised to make. A woman who took her coffee black was a woman who understood what she was doing. A woman who used saccharin instead of sugar was also understood to be a woman who was paying attention. These small visible signals of dietary intention were part of the social language of weight management in the era. I want to spend some time on the role of dairy in 1950s diet culture because it is complicated in ways that are interesting. Milk was a deeply culturally loaded food during this period, associated with health, with American values, with the nourishment of children and families in ways that made it difficult to discuss critically. The dairy industry was also extremely powerful and extremely active in shaping public understanding of its products, with the result that women received clear and consistent messaging about the health benefits of dairy, while receiving very little useful guidance about which dairy products were compatible with weight management and which were not. Whole milk, butter, cream cheese, sour cream, these were all foods that appeared regularly on the American table in the 1950s, associated with wholesome domestic cooking and with the kind of family nourishment that a good wife and mother provided. They were also calorie-dense in ways that created real challenges for women who were trying to manage their intake. The resolution was not to eliminate dairy, which was culturally unthinkable and would have seemed contrary to health, but to manage which dairy products appeared at different points in the daily eating pattern. Cottage cheese was the solution, and it appeared everywhere. Low-fat and regular cottage cheese were both available, though the full range of fat percentages we now navigate had not yet developed as a marketing category. What was available was a relatively low-fat dairy product with high protein content that could be substituted for more calorie-dense options in a wide range of contexts. Cottage cheese appeared as a lunch staple, as a snack, as a component in casseroles, mixed with fruit as a sort of dessert-adjacent dish, on crackers as a spread. It was bland, it was serviceable, it was safe in the caloric accounting sense, and it was protein-rich enough to be genuinely satisfying. Skim milk was recommended as a substitute for whole milk in beverages and in cooking for women managing their weight, though skim milk in the early 1950s was a product that was just beginning to be widely available commercially. Before the development of modern fat reduction technology in dairy processing, removing fat from milk was a domestic process, letting whole milk sit until the cream rose and skimming the cream off the top. The resulting product was somewhat different from modern commercially processed skim milk, and women who chose it were making a real sacrifice of palatability in service of caloric reduction. The low-fat dairy category as a commercial enterprise was beginning to develop during this period, and its development was partly a response to the demand created by women who wanted to manage their caloric intake from dairy without eliminating dairy entirely. The product category grew as a response to the need, and the need was real because the cultural pressure to maintain dairy consumption while also maintaining slimness was real. Now let me take you into the afternoon, which was in some ways the most challenging period of the day for women managing their eating. The morning had its structure: breakfast, the morning's work, perhaps a mid-morning coffee. The evening had its structure: the family dinner, which was fixed and formal and had its own rules. But the afternoon was unstructured in a way that created both freedom and danger. The children were at school, the household work of the morning was done. There might be errands, there might be social calls, there might be bridge club or church committee, or any of the other activities that occupied the social calendar of a respectable housewife. But there were also hours, stretches of quiet afternoon time, when hunger arrived, and there was nothing to prevent eating except the woman's own intentions. The 3 o'clock crisis was a real phenomenon in the diet advice literature of the era. 3 in the afternoon was identified in enough different sources to be noteworthy, as the hour when willpower was lowest and appetite was highest, the midpoint between lunch and dinner when the body was seeking energy and the afternoon stretched ahead in a way that made food feel both necessary and available. Women who managed their eating successfully through the morning often found themselves making choices in the 3 o'clock hour that they later regretted. The strategies developed for this hour were interesting. Walking was recommended, not as formal exercise, but as the activity of going somewhere, doing something, getting out of the kitchen, changing the physical context in which the craving was arising. A woman who walked to the store at 3 o'clock was a woman who was not standing in her kitchen eating from the refrigerator. The walk accomplished the errand, occupied the hour, and removed the immediate proximity to the food that made eating the path of least resistance. The planned alternative snack was another strategy. The idea that having decided in advance what you would eat at 3 o'clock, and having that option prepared and available, reduced the likelihood of making unplanned and potentially regrettable food choices under the pressure of afternoon hunger. The raw vegetables already washed and cut in the refrigerator, the hard-boiled egg already prepared, the cup of bouillon that only required adding hot water. These were not improvised responses to hunger, they were planned provisions against it. Women were advised to treat 3 o'clock the way a general treats a position that needs to be defended, with preparation, with alternatives in place, with the situation planned in advance rather than improvised in the moment. This is essentially what modern behavioral psychologists call implementation intention. Deciding in advance exactly what you will do in a specific situation reduces the cognitive load of the decision and increases the likelihood of following through on your intentions. The 1950s diet advice literature arrived at this principle through practical observation rather than psychological theory, but the principle was the same. The Bridge Club and its food implications deserve a brief discussion because they represent a specific social minefield for the diet-conscious woman. Bridge was a popular social activity for women in the 1950s, and bridge clubs involved the rotation of hosting duties, with the host providing refreshments for the group. These refreshments were typically sweet and rich, the kind of small, beautiful, elaborately prepared sweets and savories that women's magazines spent considerable space advising on how to prepare and present. A woman hosting bridge was expected to put out something impressive. A woman attending bridge was expected to eat what was offered. The negotiation between the social obligation to eat and the dietary obligation to not eat too much was handled with the same invisible care that women brought to social eating generally. A small piece of the fancy cake, a few of the petits fours, enough to constitute engagement with the hospitality without constituting meaningful caloric damage. The art was in eating enough to honor the hostess's effort without eating so much that your own restraint was compromised. It was a social and dietary negotiation conducted entirely without words, in the small decisions of how much to take and how much to leave on the plate. The evening meal was the final major caloric event of the day, and the strategies women used around it reflect the particular complexity of their position as both preparer and consumer of the family's most significant daily meal. Cooking and serving without continuous tasting was an art that women cultivated deliberately. Every cooking teacher and cooking column of the era advised tasting as you cook, adjusting seasoning, evaluating doneness, and every tasting involved a small caloric input. Women who were managing their intake carefully developed a kind of cooking touch that relied on observation, smell, and experience more than tasting, reducing the frequency with which small tastes were required. A woman who had made a certain dish dozens of times could judge its seasoning by eye and smell rather than taste without compromising the result. Serving the family before serving themselves, going around the table to portion out the food, filling the children's plates, the husband's plate, before sitting down and taking their own portion, accomplished several things simultaneously. It fulfilled the role of the attentive server that the social structure of the family dinner required. It also meant that a woman had seen exactly what was on the table and in what quantities before making her own choices, which allowed a more deliberate calculation of what was available and what was appropriate for her to take. And it put physical activity, the standing and moving and serving, between the hunger of waiting for dinner and the act of eating, which blunted the urgency of the appetite slightly. Smaller plates were a strategy that circulated in diet advice long before the modern version of the research on it, which reliably shows that people eat less when their portion is served on a smaller plate, even when the total food available is identical. The visual proportion of food to plate surface area affects how much food feels appropriate to eat, regardless of the actual quantity. A woman who served her own dinner on a salad plate rather than a dinner plate was using a visual trick on herself that was real and effective, even if she would have described it simply as watching her portions. Eating slowly at dinner, putting the fork down between bites, engaging in conversation. These strategies served multiple purposes at the evening meal. They made the meal last longer, which meant that satiety signals had more time to develop before the plate was empty. They made the woman appear engaged and present in the family dinner, which was socially appropriate and required, and they stretched the experience of the meal into something that felt more substantial than the caloric reality of what was being eaten. Women of this era were also advised, in various formulations, to stop eating before feeling full, to leave the table slightly hungry rather than comfortably satisfied. The phrase "still a little hungry" was treated as evidence of successful dining rather than failed dining. The discomfort of mild hunger at the end of dinner was to be accepted and reframed as the feeling of success, not the feeling of deprivation. This psychological reframing of hunger as achievement rather than as deficit was central to how women of the era made the project of calorie restriction sustainable as a daily practice. You did not tell yourself you were going hungry, you told yourself you were choosing to stop. After dinner was another danger zone, and women knew it. The hour after dinner, when the family was settled and the dishes were done and there was nothing left to do except sit, had a quality of openness that made eating easy and almost inevitable without deliberate management. Dessert was the formal structure that organized the after-dinner period, and women who were managing their weight carefully made deliberate choices about whether to participate in dessert, in what form, in what quantity. The deliberate substitution of low-calorie desserts was one strategy. Gelatin desserts, which were heavily marketed to women during this era through the Jell-O advertising campaigns and through the enormous quantity of gelatin-based recipes that appeared in women's magazines, offered a dessert experience that was sweet and satisfying in texture while being extremely low in calories. A bowl of Jell-O or a molded Jell-O dessert made with fruit provided closure to the meal in the psychological sense while adding minimal caloric consequence. Fresh fruit as dessert was consistently recommended in diet advice, and consistently a slightly uncomfortable social choice in the context of family entertaining, where a fruit plate could seem like an insufficient close to a generous meal. Women navigated this by serving both, the rich dessert for everyone else, a small portion or none, and the fruit for themselves, in a way that was usually not commented on because it was so normal, because everyone at the table understood what a woman serving herself fruit while serving everyone else cake was doing, and because the social convention was not to discuss it. Coffee after dinner served the same function that mid-morning coffee served, providing a ritualized endpoint to the eating period that signaled its conclusion both psychologically and physiologically. The warmth of the cup, the bitterness of the coffee, the ritual of its preparation and consumption, all of it created a boundary that said dinner is over and what comes now is not eating. The after-dinner coffee was not just a beverage, It was a closing ceremony for the day's most significant meal. I want to take a step back here and talk about something that runs underneath all of these specific strategies, something that is both about diet and about something much larger, because the extraordinary attention that women in the 1950s paid to managing their bodies, the elaborate system of strategies and calculations and social negotiations that daily weight management involved, was not happening in a neutral context. It was happening in the context of a culture that treated a woman's body as fundamentally public property, subject to evaluation by her husband, her neighbors, her family, her doctor, and everyone she encountered socially. Her body was the visible evidence of her character. Too much weight suggested a failure of self-discipline that had implications for her entire identity as a respectable woman. The dietary strategies she used were not merely personal wellness choices, they were social survival tools, performed in the context of real and significant social consequences for non-compliance. This is not comfortable to sit with. The women who are the subject of this story were not victims in any simple sense. They were intelligent, resourceful people who made practical decisions within the constraints of their world, many of which were not chosen constraints. The strategies we have been discussing, the cottage cheese and the saccharin tablets and the smaller plates and the 3 o'clock vegetable tray, were genuinely effective for many of them. They maintained the weights they were aiming for. They navigated the social expectations of their world successfully. But the cost of that navigation was ongoing and real. The constant attention required, the portion of cognitive energy that was permanently allocated to the management of the body, the particular kind of relationship with food that developed when food was simultaneously something you produced abundantly for others and carefully rationed for yourself, when appetite was something to be managed rather than listened to, when the experience of hunger was evidence of virtue rather than a signal to be attended to. The women of this era would not, for the most part, have described this situation as oppressive. They would not have used that language, and many of them would have actively rejected it. They understood themselves to be making sensible choices in a world that had real requirements. They took pride in their slim figures, in their disciplined eating, in the ability to put a beautiful dinner on the table while maintaining their appearance. These were genuine sources of satisfaction and self-respect in a world that offered them as such. What we can see from this distance, with the benefit of decades of subsequent research on eating behavior and body image and women's relationship with food, is that the specific configuration of that world, the expectations, the surveillance, the moral coding of appetite and restraint, produced patterns of eating that were in some ways adaptive and in some ways genuinely harmful. The normalization of chronic mild hunger, the disconnection from appetite as a guide to eating, the relationship between food and virtue and shame that could in more vulnerable individuals tip over into something more serious and more damaging. The eating disorders that we now recognize as clinical conditions were not absent from the 1950s. They existed, they caused suffering, they sometimes caused serious harm. They were simply not named as eating disorders in the way we would name them now. A woman who did not eat was exercising extraordinary restraint. A woman who ate and then purged was doing something that was not spoken about openly in any context where it might be understood and addressed. The framework for understanding disordered eating as a health problem, rather than a character quality, was not available in the 1950s. Let me return from that difficult territory to some of the more specific and frankly fascinating details of the daily dietary strategies, because I think there is more to cover that is both historically interesting and practically illuminating. The role of texture in the diet thinking of this era is one that doesn't get discussed much, but that was genuinely present in the advice that circulated. The recommendation to eat crunchy, textured foods rather than smooth, soft foods was based on the observation that eating requires more effort and more time when the food has texture that must be worked through, and therefore extends the eating period and generates more sensory satisfaction per calorie. A handful of celery sticks provides much more oral and sensory activity than an equivalent caloric portion of mashed potato. The physical work of eating the celery, the chewing, the crunch, the time required, means that the food does more psychological work per unit of time than softer, quicker foods. This observation found its way into advice in various forms. Eat an apple instead of apple juice. Choose raw vegetables over cooked ones when possible. Take crackers rather than soft bread. The underlying principle was consistent. The more physical engagement the eating required, the more satisfying it was relative to its caloric content. Raw carrots were practically fetishized in the diet culture of the 1950s for exactly this reason. They were almost nothing in caloric terms. They took a significant amount of time and effort to eat. They were filling to chew, if not filling in the stomach, and they were understood to be completely safe in a diet context. The advice to keep a bag of raw carrots in the refrigerator for snacking was repeated across so many magazine columns and doctor's office pamphlets that it became essentially universal. Women who followed any dietary plan at all, whether specific or informal, tended to have raw carrots in their refrigerators. It was practically a dietary signal of the era. The role of specific meals versus general eating patterns is worth discussing because the 1950s diet advice literature had very clear preferences on this question. The advice to eat 3 meals per day at regular times, rather than snacking continuously or eating irregularly, was nearly universal and was grounded in reasoning about both metabolism and appetite management that has some support in subsequent research. Regular meal timing was believed to regulate appetite, to prevent the kind of chaotic hunger that could lead to unplanned eating, and to give the digestive system the regularity that was believed to support efficient metabolism. Snacking between meals was generally discouraged, not because all snacks were equal in caloric terms, but because the habit of eating between meals was understood to weaken the discipline of the meal structure, to make appetite less predictable, and to add up in ways that regular meals did not. This advice aligned reasonably well with research suggesting that eating patterns with distinct meal periods and limited snacking are associated with better appetite regulation in many individuals, though the relationship is complex and individual variation is significant. The practical wisdom of the era was operating in the right general direction even when the specific mechanisms claimed for it were imprecise. The specific timing of meals was also considered important. Eating dinner early, by 5 or 6 in the evening, was associated with better weight management in the diet advice of the era for reasons that were articulated in terms of digestion and sleep and the body's nighttime metabolic activity. Eating late at night was considered to deposit food as fat because the body would be resting rather than active and therefore could not use the calories constructively. The biochemistry of this reasoning was significantly oversimplified, but the practical outcome, eating dinner reasonably early and not eating substantially after dinner, does appear to have some relationship with weight management outcomes, partly through effects on the timing of the overnight fast and partly through the simple arithmetic of total daily caloric intake. The evening fast was not called the evening fast in the 1950s. That language came much later, along with the more recent research on time-restricted eating and intermittent fasting. But the practice of not eating after dinner, of treating the evening as a non-eating period and night as the beginning of a fast that extended through to the next morning's breakfast, was recommended consistently and practiced widely. It was good advice that happened to be given for reasons that were only partially correct. One of the more unusual dietary strategies that circulated in the 1950s was based on the idea of food combining, the notion that certain foods were beneficial or harmful in combination, and that managing which foods were eaten together at a given meal could have effects on digestion, on weight, and on energy that were independent of the total caloric content of what was eaten. The theory, which derived from earlier work by the health reformer Herbert Shelton and was popularized in various forms through the mid-century period, held that proteins and carbohydrates should not be eaten together at the same meal because they required different digestive environments, and eating them together created a kind of digestive conflict that impaired both digestion and metabolisms. The science behind food combining is not well supported by subsequent research, and the specific claims made for it were largely not validated. But the practices it encouraged, eating simpler meals with fewer mixed elements, separating the fruit portion of the diet to be eaten on its own rather than with other foods, limiting the amount of starchy carbohydrates at meals that also contained protein, had the practical effect of simplifying meals in ways that often reduced caloric intake without the practitioner consciously restricting. A meal of protein and non-starchy vegetables is lower in calories than a meal of protein, starchy carbohydrates and vegetables. If food combining theory led women to eat the former instead of the latter, the theory was producing a useful outcome through a mechanism that was incorrect, but whose practical result was aligned with the goal. The Hollywood diet is worth discussing because it represents one of the most extreme endpoints of the rapid weight loss approaches that circulated during this period, and because the story of where it came from and how it worked is more interesting than it might initially seem. The Hollywood 18-day diet, which circulated widely in the early 1950s, was essentially a severely restricted calorie plan, built largely around grapefruit, eggs, and very limited amounts of other foods. The caloric content was extremely low. Estimates range from 500 to 800 calories per day, which is far below the level required to maintain metabolic function in any adult woman. The weight loss it produced was rapid and dramatic, which is exactly what made it appealing and what also made it genuinely dangerous over any extended period. Women who followed the Hollywood diet for 18 days or for any significant period were putting their bodies through a level of caloric restriction that produced metabolic adaptation, muscle loss alongside fat loss, nutritional deficiency, and the physiological conditions for rapid weight regain when normal eating resumed. None of this was explained to them. The diet was presented as a temporary protocol for rapid weight loss, and the rapid weight loss it produced was real and verifiable, and therefore served as its own validation. The consequences that followed after were attributed to the woman's subsequent choices rather than to the physiological effects of the severe restriction itself. This pattern, the rapid weight loss diet that works in the short term and causes regain in the longer term, with the regain attributed to individual failure rather than to the predictable physiological response to restriction, was so characteristic of the mid-century diet industry that it shaped the entire subsequent history of commercial diet culture. The cycle of restrict, lose, regain, and restrict again was established during this period in the lives of millions of women who followed successive diet plans with genuine determination and who attributed their repeated failures to their own inadequacy rather than to the fundamental properties of the diets themselves. Let me tell you something about the thyroid, because the thyroid gland occupied a particular place in the popular dietary imagination of the 1950s that is interesting and somewhat complicated. The thyroid regulates metabolism, and a hypothyroid condition, an underactive thyroid, produces weight gain and difficulty losing weight even with caloric restriction. This much was medically understood. What was less well understood, and what therefore created some genuine confusion in the diet advice literature, was the scale at which thyroid insufficiency actually explained women's difficulty losing weight. In the 1950s, thyroid extract was available and was prescribed by some physicians for women who were struggling with their weight, even in the absence of a confirmed thyroid deficiency. The reasoning was that if a normal thyroid regulated metabolism at a certain rate, supplementing thyroid hormone might boost that rate in women who were not losing weight as expected on restricted diets. This practice, which involved administering a powerful metabolic hormone to people without a demonstrated hormone deficiency, was not carefully monitored and had real potential for harm. Cardiac effects, anxiety, bone loss, the consequences of excess thyroid hormone are well documented, but for women who tried thyroid supplements and found that they did lose weight while taking them, and some did, at least initially, the experience confirmed the general idea that the thyroid was the key to the stubborn metabolism problem and that pharmaceutical intervention in its function was appropriate. This reinforced a broader pattern in mid-century medical culture of treating women's bodies as appropriate subjects for hormonal and pharmaceutical management in ways that would not be acceptable under modern regulatory standards. Seaweed preparations were sold with claims about their effects on thyroid function, the iodine in seaweed being genuinely relevant to thyroid synthesis in a way that gave these claims a thin biological plausibility, and kelp tablets became popular in the early health food stores that were developing as a retail category during this period. Whether the kelp tablets actually helped anyone lose weight is a separate question from whether they were believed to help, and the belief was real enough to sustain a small but genuine market for them. Let me talk about the specific role of vinegar, because it keeps appearing in the diet strategies of this era, with enough consistency to be notable. The use of apple cider vinegar before meals as a weight management aid goes back further than the 1950s. It appeared in the health recommendations of older folk traditions and had been popularized in various forms in the early 20th century, but it was present in 1950s diet culture as a fairly standard piece of advice, recommended in some women's health columns and passed between women as a kind of dietary folk wisdom. The proposed mechanisms were various and not always consistent. Vinegar was said to aid digestion, to have a mild appetite-suppressing effect, to affect blood sugar in ways that reduced cravings, and to have some direct effect on fat metabolisms. Some of these claims have been the subject of more recent research, with results that are interesting if not conclusively supportive. Acetic acid, the primary component of vinegar, does appear to have modest effects on postprandial blood glucose and insulin levels, which aligns with the folk observation that eating something acidic before a meal might affect how hungry you remain afterward. The practice of eating pickles or other vinegar-preserved vegetables as a component of a diet-conscious lunch was related to this general category of thinking. Acidic, pickled foods were understood to have some beneficial digestive and metabolic effect that was vaguely different from just eating raw vegetables. Whether this understanding was fully accurate or not, the practice of including fermented and acidic foods in the diet is now understood to have genuine effects on gut microbiota and digestion that may support healthy weight management through mechanisms the 1950s had no language for. The metabolism question was one that preoccupied women and their physicians throughout the 1950s in ways that often reflected genuine confusion about the relationship between individual variation and caloric arithmetic. The simple version of caloric theory, eat less, weigh less, was true in the aggregate but frustratingly inconsistent in individual experience. Women who ate the same diet under apparently similar conditions sometimes had dramatically different outcomes, and the explanation for this variation was not well understood. The language of fast and slow metabolisms, the idea that some people burn calories more efficiently than others as a fundamental matter of individual biology, was present in popular understanding during this period, though the biochemical basis for this observation was not precisely articulated. Women who struggled to lose weight despite what they described as careful eating were sometimes told that they had a slow metabolism, which was simultaneously a comfort, because it located the difficulty outside their control, and a frustration, because it suggested the condition was fixed and unchangeable. Some of the variation that women were attributing to metabolic difference was almost certainly the result of differences in activity level, in portion estimation accuracy, in the frequency of small eating occasions that were not being counted, and in the physiological adaptations to dieting that made repeated dieters' bodies more efficient at storing energy. But some of it was also genuine metabolic variation, differences in resting metabolic rate, in thermogenic responses to food, in the efficiency with which different individuals extract energy from identical diets, that research has since established as real and significant. The dietary advice literature of the period was not well equipped to account for this individual variation, and its failure to do so contributed to the moral weight that attached to dieting failure. If the science says eat fewer calories and you will lose weight, and you are eating fewer calories and not losing weight, the implied conclusion is that you are not actually eating fewer calories, that your account of your own behavior is inaccurate. This experience of doing what you believed was right and not getting the expected result, and having that result interpreted as evidence of your own dishonesty or self-deception, was one that many women of the era encountered in the diet advice from their physicians and from the popular press, and it was genuinely corrosive. Let me take you into the specific social world of reducing clubs, because these were a genuine institution of the 1950s diet culture, and one that has interesting connections to the later development of commercial weight loss organizations. TOPS, Take Off Pounds Sensibly, was founded in 1948 by Esther Manns in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and became one of the first significant weight loss support organizations in America. It was a non-profit, non-commercial organization built around the idea that community accountability and mutual support were powerful tools for weight management that individual dieting lacked. Members met weekly, weighed in on a scale in front of the group, shared experiences and strategies, and celebrated weight loss publicly while providing encouragement to those who had not made progress or had gained. Tops grew rapidly through the 1950s, and by the end of the decade had chapters across the United States with hundreds of thousands of members. Its success was attributable to several factors that the subsequent research on behavior change has validated. Public commitment, the fact of weighing in front of other people, creates accountability that internal commitment alone does not. Social support, the presence of other people engaged in the same effort, provides both practical information exchange and emotional sustenance. And the celebration of success within a community that understands the difficulty of the project makes the success more meaningful and more motivating than private achievement. The TOPS model predated Weight Watchers, which was founded in 1963 and in some ways anticipated the insights about social behavior change that would make Weight Watchers successful. The women who gathered in church basements and community halls in the early 1950s to weigh in together and share recipes and strategies were doing something that was genuinely effective in a way that individual dieting often was not, and they were doing it through the informal application of principles that behavioral psychology would later formalize. The content of what was shared at these meetings was the practical folk wisdom of the era, the strategies we have been discussing, traded and refined and adapted by women who are working with them daily and comparing notes on what was actually effective. The cottage cheese recipes, the vegetable trays, the water before meals, the saccharin in the coffee, the smaller plates and the slower eating, and the hard-boiled egg kept in the refrigerator, all of it circulating in the informal network of women who are engaged in the same project and who had practical knowledge to share. There is something rather beautiful about that when you sit with it. These women, without any formal training, without access to the behavioral research that would later validate much of what they were doing, were building a practical science of weight management from the materials available to them. Careful observation, experience, comparison, and the particular kind of intelligence that comes from really paying attention to your own body and the bodies of the women around you, and noticing what actually worked. The role of the physician deserves one more visit before we move toward the close of this story, because the formal medical relationship was a significant part of how women understood and managed their weight during this period, and the nature of that relationship was more complex than simple good or bad advice. The ideal weight that a woman was working toward was typically set or confirmed in a physician's office, referencing those Metropolitan Life Insurance Company charts, and the regular weigh-in at the doctor's office was part of the accountability structure of formal weight management. A woman who was seeing her doctor for any reason would be weighed, and the result would be noted and commented on. Weight above the ideal range was addressed as a health concern, in the same way that an abnormal blood pressure reading would be addressed. This medicalization of weight, the framing of a weight above the insurance company's ideal range as a health problem requiring medical management, was not without its reasonable elements. The associations between excess weight and certain health conditions were being established in the medical literature of the period, and the interest in weight management as a health matter, rather than merely an aesthetic one, gave diet medicine a legitimacy that purely cosmetic approaches lacked. But it also brought the full apparatus of medical authority to bear on a domain where the advice was often less scientifically grounded than the authoritative tone in which it was delivered suggested. Women left their physicians' offices with dietary instructions, sometimes with prescriptions for appetite suppressants, sometimes with specific caloric targets, and always with the clear understanding that their weight was a matter of medical interest that their doctor would be watching. This surveillance, the combination of the internal surveillance of daily weight management and the external surveillance of the medical encounter, created a context in which a woman's body was always, at some level, being accounted for. The annual physical examination became a site of dietary accountability. The routine weigh-in at any medical appointment became a moment of assessment that a woman might spend weeks preparing for, eating more carefully, drinking more water, doing what needed to be done to make the number on the scale acceptable before the appointment. This preparation for medical scrutiny was itself a kind of performance that revealed the depth to which appearance management had been internalized as a primary obligation. Let me tell you about the postpartum period specifically, because this was a particular focus of intense dietary attention in the 1950s, and because it represents one of the most pressured moments in the whole story of women and weight in that era. The expectation that a woman would return to her pre-pregnancy weight within a defined and relatively short period after giving birth was explicit and enforced by social and medical pressure in ways that are remarkable from a modern perspective. Women's magazines published articles about how to regain your figure after the baby with timelines and strategies. Physicians discussed expected weight loss trajectories with postpartum patients. The husbands, who had watched their wives' bodies change through pregnancy, expected to see them return to the bodies they had married. There was very little acknowledgement in any of these conversations of the genuine physiological complexity of postpartum body recovery, the hormonal landscape, the demands of breastfeeding, the physical recovery from labor and delivery, the sleep deprivation that made anything requiring sustained effort and attention extremely difficult. The postpartum woman was expected to manage her weight reduction with the same discipline and resourcefulness she brought to everything else, in the same time frame, without significant additional resources or support. The strategies she used during this period were essentially the same ones we have been discussing, deployed with additional urgency. The nursing advice complicated things slightly. Women who were breastfeeding were told that they needed additional calories to support milk production, which created a genuine tension with the goal of rapid weight loss. The resolution most often offered was that breastfeeding itself would burn the extra calories and aid the weight loss, which is partially true. Lactation does consume significant energy, but which oversimplified a genuinely complex metabolic situation. Women who did not breastfeed had no such complication and could begin what was sometimes called getting back into shape immediately after the recovery from delivery, which in the 1950s typically meant a hospital stay of several days, followed by a recommended period of reduced activity at home. Once that period was passed, the expectation was that dietary management would resume with full seriousness. The market for maternity corsets and postnatal girdles was significant during this period, reflecting the expectation that the body would be physically compressed back toward its pre-pregnancy shape during the period when it was also recovering and adapting to the enormous changes of pregnancy and delivery. The tools of appearance management were expected to be immediately operative, regardless of the biological reality underneath them. There is one more dimension to this story that I want to bring in before we draw toward the end, and it is the dimension of class and access, because the dietary strategies we have been discussing were not equally available to all women in the 1950s, and the pressures that drove them were not equally distributed. The women who shopped at the grocery store for cottage cheese and fresh vegetables and grapefruit and lean meats were women who had the income to choose what they ate based on dietary preference rather than economic necessity. Working-class women and poor women in the 1950s faced a different food environment, one where the cheapest available calories were often the starchiest and most calorie-dense, where fresh vegetables were a luxury that consumed a disproportionate portion of a tight food budget, where the kind of deliberate dietary management we have been discussing was simply not available as a daily practice. The diet advice in women's magazines was addressed, implicitly and explicitly, to a woman of comfortable middle-class circumstances who had the time, the money, and the domestic infrastructure to implement strategies that required thought and choice. A woman who was working outside the home, raising children largely alone, and managing a very tight budget, did not have the same access to the dietary tools that the magazine advice assumed. She was still subject to the same social expectations about her appearance, the same scrutiny from neighbors and family and physicians, but she had fewer resources with which to meet them. This class dimension of the 1950s diet culture tends to be invisible in popular treatments of the era, which focus on the suburban housewife as the representative figure. But the social pressure to be slim was not limited to the suburban housewife, and the strategies available to meet it were not equally accessible across the economic landscape. Race is part of this story too, though in ways that are even less often discussed. African American women in the 1950s were navigating a diet and beauty culture that was predominantly designed for and addressed to white women, while also existing within their own communities that had different traditions and different standards. The relationship between black women and the diet culture of this period was complex in ways that resist easy summary, The dominant culture's beauty standards, including its weight standards, were white-centric in ways that black women were simultaneously subject to and excluded from, and the negotiation of that position was something that each individual woman worked out within her specific circumstances and community context. As we come toward the close of this long evening together, I want to spend a few minutes sitting with what all of this actually meant, what it produced, what we carry forward from it into the present. The specific strategies, the cottage cheese and the saccharin and the raw vegetables and the water before meals and the smaller plates, these did not disappear with the 1950s. Many of them are still in circulation today, sometimes under new names, sometimes backed by the modern research that explains why they work in a way the 1950s version of the advice could not provide. When a modern nutrition coach tells you to pre-hydrate before meals, or to increase your protein intake for satiety, or to eat in a shorter daily window, they are in many cases teaching things that have been known and practiced for longer than the scientific framing makes them seem. The diet pill story has continued and ramified in ways that the 1950s version did not predict. The specific drugs have changed, but the fundamental premise that pharmaceutical intervention in appetite and metabolism is an appropriate tool for weight management in women has been continuously reinvented through the decades, each iteration promising to have learned from the errors of the last, each producing its own unforeseen consequences, each reflecting the same underlying cultural demand that women's bodies should be manageable to standards that nature alone will not reliably produce. The eating disorder story has also continued, with the formal development of diagnostic categories and treatment approaches that did not exist in the 1950s, and with much clearer understanding now of the relationship between restrictive dieting cultures and the development of clinically significant disordered eating patterns. The women of the 1950s, who were the most rigidly disciplined in their food management, who took the project of caloric restraint to its most systematic extreme, were working in a culture that rewarded them for it, up to the point where the behavior became visibly pathological and had no good way to identify or respond to it at the level below that point. The social environment has changed in complex ways. The specific set of body ideals that characterized the 1950s, the nipped waist, the controlled curves, the new-look silhouette, has been through many subsequent iterations, and the current moment's body ideals are different in content from those of the 1950s. While sharing many structural features, they are still being actively shaped by commercial interests, still being communicated through media, still being internalized by women as personal obligations, still producing the same quiet, exhausting daily management. The strategies that were passed between women over coffee and at reducing clubs and in the margins of magazine columns in the 1950s were the strategies of people making the best of a world they did not design and could not easily change. They were the practical intelligence of women who understood the rules of the game they were playing and played it with real skill. The rules were wrong in many ways. The game should not have needed to be played, but the women who played it were not wrong to be intelligent about how they did it. There is something in the image of those women, standing at the mirror in the morning, conducting the quiet inventory, making the small decisions that would accumulate into a life that met the requirements of their world, that asks to be honored even as we examine it honestly. They were managing something impossible. They were managing it with extraordinary resourcefulness, and many of them managed it without complaint, because complaint about the conditions of one's life was not considered gracious, and they were, whatever else, committed to being gracious. What they passed down to their daughters was complicated. Some of it was useful, some of it was damaging, some of it was both simultaneously. The daughters who grew up in 1950s households watching their mothers manage their food and their bodies absorbed lessons about discipline and restraint and the importance of appearance that shaped them in ways both intended and unintended. The subsequent decades of women's relationship with food and body image are in some significant part the inheritance of this era, worked through and against and around but never simply left behind. When you watch a woman in the 1950s cut a smaller slice of cake for herself while serving full pieces to everyone else at the table, when you see her reach into the refrigerator at 3 in the afternoon and take out the prepared vegetables rather than the thing she actually wants, when you notice her dropping a saccharin tablet into her coffee at a luncheon, and tucking the small silver dispenser back into her purse before anyone sees it. You are watching something that is simultaneously banal and profound. You are watching a person navigate the terms of her existence with everything she has available. The specific strategies may belong to their era. The underlying negotiation does not. Women are still managing the gap between what their bodies naturally do and what their worlds expect them to look like, using whatever tools their particular moment makes available. The tools change, the management does not. Understanding where it came from and what it cost the women who practiced it seems like the minimum we owe them. The light is getting low now, and this is a good place to let the story rest. The women we have been talking about tonight are mostly gone. The ones who were young in 1953 are in their 90s now if they are still with us, and their daughters are themselves aging into the years when the body's demands and the culture's demands have different conversations than they did at 30. But the kitchen drawers where the food diaries were kept, the bathroom scales they weighed themselves on every morning, the saccharin dispensers in the purses, the cottage cheese in the refrigerators, the smaller plates set before themselves while the generous dinner was served around the table, all of it is still legible, still readable as evidence of a life being managed with intelligence and care in conditions that intelligence and care alone could not fix. That is not a small thing. It is in its quiet and imperfect and complicated way something worth knowing. Sleep well tonight, wherever you are. Carry something from this story with you into the morning, even if it is only the image of a woman dropping a saccharin tablet into her coffee with a careful private hand, doing what she needed to do, knowing what it cost her, doing it anyway. That is, for whatever it is worth, a kind of grace,